Hey, what's up guys, TechTine here and I'm back again with a brand new video. Really quickly before I begin, I do want to thank you all so much for watching. If you enjoy my content, leave a thumbs up. Also, consider subscribing. It does help me out a lot. And so with that being said, today we're going to be comparing the Samsung Galaxy A17 versus the TCL Next Paper 70 Pro. For the sake of review, the TCL phone, I'm going to call it the Next Paper. Just because the name is ridiculously long. But yeah, so let's talk about the design first. But both of these phones fall under a similar price bracket, so it's only fair that we see which one is worth your money. And if you're in the market for a phone at around 200 to 250 bucks, one of these phones could be a good option for you. And so from the design, if we look at just material, they both share a pretty similar material of choice, which is plastic and glass. And plastic being the chassis of the phone, glass is obviously being the display. But from just a looks perspective, they both also share sort of a simplistic design. Nothing too crazy, nothing too dramatic like a nothing phone for a Pro or anything crazy like that. On the back of the phone, you'll see that the TCL has a dual camera setup versus the triple camera setup, which we will definitely talk about later on. But I do have to say that in the TCL Next Paper 70 Pro, if we actually look at the sides, you have the power button, volume up and down, which both have fingerprint sensors attached to it. But the TCL Next Paper 70 Pro does have sort of the kind of slider that controls the display. More on that later. On the bottom of the phone, they both have speakers, USB-C, microphone. The TCL does have the SIM tray to the side. And on the top of the phone where the TCL stands out is actually within the IR blaster, which you don't really see in phones nowadays, let alone phones at this kind of price bracket. So that's definitely a thumbs up. Now, if I were to pick a phone just roughly off of design, you can't go wrong with either of these phones, but the TCL does win my vote just because it has the IR blaster as well as the slider that has functionality, which again we will talk about once we actually dive into the display of both of these devices. But, I mean, if you look at it from just strictly a design perspective, again, they both share a simplistic design. The Galaxy A17 has its own traits, like the kind of the way that the camera lens looks, while the TCL Next Paper does actually borrow from something like the Galaxy S25 Edge, which I talked about in my full review, but like I said, both made out of plastic, both very slippery. Highly recommend the case on both of these devices. Now, I do want to switch the topic of conversation and talk about the display of both of these phones, beginning with the Galaxy A17, which the Samsung Galaxy A17 does have a 6.7-inch AMOLED display that supports 90 Hz of refresh rate, which provides a more vibrant, better colors than the TCL Next Paper. And overall, as far as longevity, Samsung knows how to make displays. The bezels are slightly larger, but to be honest with you, they're not that bad. For a phone at this price point, an AMOLED screen is almost luxurious. Now, the Next Paper 70 Pro does have a 6.9-inch display. It does have an IPS LCD panel, and it does support a higher refresh rate at 120 Hz. And for this price bracket, this phone's display is actually kind of crazy. And the display itself has this sort of anti-glare that gives you almost a sort of a matte finish when you're touching the display. And it also gives it sort of an almost paper-like display, thus the name The Next Paper. Now, the slider gives you a couple of options that provide some unique features, which are ink mode, paper ink mode, and color mode. And because it's a hardware kind of feature, the slider is so quick to use. So you just slide it up, choose one of your modes, and it's so freaking seamless to transition between them. My favorite is this kind of color mode, but the ink mode is mainly if you want to just read books, have limited functionality to your phone if you're in a situation where you need a lot of battery life, which if you do turn on that mode, you will save plenty of battery. And like I said, the transition is very seamless. Now, when I put these phones side by side as far as the display, under harsh lighting conditions, I found that the AMOLED display still manages to be brighter than the Next Paper. However, viewing angles do look really nice on that Next Paper. So harsher conditions, the AMOLED screen wins, but for your everyday life, I think the Next Paper does have a more of a nicer looking display, even though the A17 is an AMOLED screen. So an important topic when it comes to these phones has to be the camera. So both of these phones do have a nice 50 megapixel camera sensors for the price point that you're paying for. They also both have ultra wide. However, in my personal testing, I did find that the images that do come out of the NXT paper are slightly better as far as the color calibration. Needless to say, they both provide at the end of the day a very similar camera capability. They both do lack 4K video recording. However, the A17 does have optical image stabilization for video, and it does take slightly better selfies than that of the NXT paper. So you make your own judgment, but I feel like as far as the camera goes, either one of these phones would be fine. And honestly, I wouldn't really complain too much about the camera experience on both of these devices considering the price bracket. But all in all, cameras are okay on both of these phones. So moving on to the performance, the NXT paper and the A17 have slightly different performance. So the NXT paper, or let's talk about the A17. So the A17 does have the Exynos 1330 with only 4 gigabytes of RAM and a 5000 milliamp hour battery, which, to be honest with you, in this day and age is just not really all that capable. When we look at the chipset of the NXT paper, you get the Dimensity 7300 with 8 gigabytes of RAM and the AMOLED G615 for your GPU, which is similar to that of something like the Moto G Power. And the battery life is slightly higher on the NXT paper. Now, 8 gigs of RAM to me, it seems sufficient. However, to be honest with you, with the A17, I noticed it lag more than I like it to be. While the software support is going to be better on the A17, the performance overall easily to the NXT paper, no doubt. Okay, so that sort of summarizes the performance. Now, I do want to speak on a final conclusion on both of these phones. Now, if you're in the market for either an A17 or an NXT paper, or even a phone under this type of price bracket, then me personally, the more interesting phone has to be the NXT paper. However, the A17 does provide more software update and an AMOLED screen that you really don't find in phones at that sort of price point. However, the NXT paper does provide with a more interesting display, while TCL has been questionable in the past, in my opinion, when making budget phones. This one seems to be a little bit more convincing. So, with that being said, I do want to hear your guys' thoughts. Which one would you pick? Like I said, me personally, I would go with the TCL NXT paper for all the features that it provides versus the Galaxy A17. And so, again, I want to hear your thoughts. Which one would you pick? Which one would you kind of go with? Let me know in the comments below. I want to thank you all so much for watching. I do appreciate you all, and I will catch you guys in the next video. Thank you for watching.